Emily's throwing my stuff around.
Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you join us. We're going to start with a quick disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so that you can see us all on camera. Welcome to Building Knowledge, Theory, and Best Practices, Lessons from the Central UPIC College and Career Readiness Project. We're so excited to be joined by our wonderful presenters today, and I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves.
Go ahead, Dana.
I guess I can go first. Sure. My name is Dana Defeo. I'm an assistant research professor and the director of the Center for Alaska Education Policy Research. So I work in a social and economic policy research institute, and I'm really interested in affecting change through social policies and programs. So I study education. I'm an education researcher, and part of my research agenda includes college and career readiness as workforce development. So I'm really interested not only in equity and representation in the outcomes that students achieve, but also in their aspirations and the forces that shape the dreams that they have for themselves. And I've been working with Excel on this project since 2016. I was there when Excel wrote the grant. So we've been working on the implementation for the last 3.5 years. And I just love this program because it puts communities first, and I can't wait to talk about it.
I'll go next. My name is Katie Davis, and I work with Dana at UAA. And I started working on this project last fall. I'm a research professional at ICER, and I am joining a master's program this fall to work on public policy and public health. Like Dana, I'm really interested in education outcomes and really excited to be presenting with Excel today.
Hi, my name is Martha Peck. I'm with Alaska Excel. We work with students in rural Alaska, getting them to get into jobs and whatever they want to do after high school graduation. We work with students from 7th grade all the way up through recent graduates, getting to come into Anchorage from rural Alaska, where they maybe in a graduating class of 1 or a little bit bigger, but not very big at all. We're happy to be here to share our findings because we've had a really great time with this grant.
Hi, my name is Emily Rickman. I get to be one of the instructors on staff at Alaska Excel here in Anchorage. I've been in the nonprofit sector for the last 5 years now, and I'm really passionate about all corners of Alaska. I was just about 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle at the beginning of the week. And I am the owner and CEO of a small business here in Alaska called the AK Coffee Company. I'm a new dog mom, and I'm continuously learning to create healthy communities, sustainable relationships that serve communities to the best of the people living in their communities. I'm a former Division I gymnast from University of Alaska Anchorage. I'm a team player. I'm an aspiring skate skier. And my background is full of creativity, innovation, teamwork, and the ability to lead and follow. I'm excited to be a part of this project and spend time with you guys today.
All right, so if everybody can see the slide, I can dive right into our project. To start off, as you heard from our introductions, we are presenting from Alaska. And aside from the time difference that we've got here, we've got a very different context, I think, than what we here call the lower 48. It's certainly darker in the winter, it's colder, and a different culture and a different history, particularly with Native communities and the history of colonization here. Alaska is also very rural. So when we're talking about our state, the National Center for Education Statistics has codes that define communities as rural or not, but those really don't work here. Based on that coding system, some of our largest communities are in the same category as some of our smallest ones. So the Regional Education Lab in Portland helped us to develop different ways to talk about our communities in Alaska in a more Alaska appropriate framework. So we've got cities, just a few, like 4 cities in the state. We've got what we would call urban fringe communities, and those are going to be within an hour's drive or an hour's ferry ride to a city with amenities where you can go grocery shopping or get healthcare. The ones that are further than an hour away, we call those our rural fringe communities. And then we've got our rural hub communities, which are accessible only by plane or by boat. But they tend to be relatively small with 1,000 or so people, but they serve as major transportation hubs for the region. If you want to get to a remote rural community, you would go from a city to a rural hub and take a very small plane to a remote rural community. So we've got about 300 communities in the state that have K-12 schools, but they're quite different. And Martha's going to talk a little bit about the service area that Excel serves.
Our service area, it's we call it Western Alaska. It's also called the Kuskokwim Delta. It's served by their transportation is on the Kuskokwim River. And it's 2 school districts. We're servicing the Upiat School District and the Kuspuk School District. The Upiat School District are the 3 schools you see in the red circle on the left: Akichuk, Akiak, and Tuluksak. And the other communities are the Kuspuk School District, Kalskag and Lower Kalskag, Aniak, Chuathbalak, Crooked Creek, Sleepmute, and Stony River. 4 of those communities actually have less than 100 people in them, and consequently the classes are very small, and many of them are 1-room classes with K-12 in the class with 1 or 2 teachers. So you can see that remote is very remote. If you want to go to Chuathbalak, Crooked Creek, Sleepmute, or Stony River, for example, you would fly from Anchorage to Aniak, and then you would either in the winter drive on the ice road where the river is frozen, or in the summer you could go by boat. Or they also have a school district plane in that particular district where you would fly to Aniak and get on the school district plane, and they would fly you to the different schools. In Upiat School District, they charter planes to fly in between each one of those villages to get students around, get teachers around, to get supplies in, and so on. So it's truly remote. Our students don't, like, we think of lower 48 rural being where the school parking lot looks somewhat like a bunch of pickup trucks, but in Alaska, a rural school parking lot is where the kids drive 4-wheelers to school. So it's pretty fun to be out in the villages and watch all that happening. It's a completely different culture for us.
Could we ask to have the slides advanced, please? So in our last slide, the state's so big, we cut off the Aleutian chain in Southeast Alaska. This just shows how big the state of Alaska is. It's more than twice the landmass of Texas, but there are more people that live in the city of Austin than in the entire state of Alaska. So when we're thinking about the school districts that we've got 54 school districts in the state that have K-12 schools. There are 5 that we would consider big school districts. In fact, one of the larger school districts in the country is the Anchorage School Districts. But there are 12 mid-sized districts that serve between 1,000 and 5,000 students. And 37 of our districts serve under 1,000 students. We've got 5 districts that have less than 100 students in the whole district. So one of our superintendents said, we've got 14 schools over a landmass the size of West Virginia, And those schools have enrollments between 10 students and 600 students. It's just a different context for schools and communities than a lot of places I've worked before. And if we could please go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we did also is we put Alaska's post-secondary institutions on the map that you saw before. We really like this map because it had the roads in Alaska. You see there are very few. But when we put the post-secondary institutions on this map, and we've got a little legend there, you can see that any student that's in the Excel service area is going to be relocating, at least temporarily, if they wish to attend a post-secondary training program. And there are jobs, and there are very good jobs for students in those communities, but they can't be trained there. And it's probably worth saying that there's a lot of talk lately about online learning, but bandwidth is also very limited in some of these communities. And so this whole process of transitioning to college, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is quite different for youth who are coming from these places. I think that's the end of this slide, please.
So with Alaska Excel, we start with 7th graders, as I mentioned before, and we have what we call foundational sessions. We work with 7th through 12th graders. In Excel 7, we begin with an introduction to leadership, and we do team working skills, introduction to that, and they leave with a new confidence in themselves. Because homesickness is a huge problem for these kids who've often never been out of their villages, we start with really short sessions. Excel 7 will be 4 days. And then when they get up to Excel 12, it'll be 12 days long. So they understand that, but by the time they realize that they're homesick in Excel 7, it's over. So it works out pretty well. In Excel 8, they expand and fine tune their leadership skills. They learn some communication skills, and they participate in motivational and team building skills. We introduce the employability skills in everything that we do. For example, if one of the activities is to take the students bowling, we would sit down and say, okay, here's the employability skills that we're going to work on. We're going to be on time, and we're going to have respect. What does that mean to you? So that we're all on the same page. We all are talking about exactly the same thing. Being on time doesn't mean running out the door, putting your jacket on at 7 o'clock. It means being in the car with your seatbelt on at 7 o'clock. So we're all on the same page. In Excel 9, we advance to introduction to the career world, and they do interactive field trips. In Excel 10, we discover in-depth view of the world of work, and they do simulated corporations. Excel 11, which is juniors, as you can tell, it corresponds with the year. Excel 10 is sophomores, Excel 11 is juniors, and so on. They explore corporation-based careers, and they're student-led, and oftentimes those corporation-based careers are actually their native corporations. Our service area for this particular grant is the Chilista region, the Chilista Native Corporation. And so we'll do interactive field trips to their native corporation here in Anchorage, and they'll see what kind of jobs there are. And then finally in Excel 12, they prepare for life after high school. They apply these life skills from the previous lessons. They're coached to apply for colleges, trades, military, the tests that go along with entrance exams or placement exams, or direct into the workforce. And they also are afforded an opportunity in Excel 11 and 12 to get their driver's licenses. Again, as we mentioned before, the students there don't have cars to drive. They have four-wheelers, and they don't have paved roads. They're dirt roads, and they don't have stop lights and so on. So the driving experience is completely new to them when they come to Anchorage. And so they take the driver's permit test, and then we hire a driving company that teaches them how to drive, and then they test out to get their driver's licenses. It's super important for them to get that, as it's the first kind of ID that's acceptable when they get their, when they go to apply for a job. They'll always ask, do you have a driver's license? For the students in rural Alaska, it's a huge hurdle for them to get that, but it's something that's very necessary. So we take care of that. We go into specialty sessions. Each student who goes to a specialty session has to have attended at least one of the foundational sessions to get to know us and to know what our expectations are, so that when we have contracted out, for example, if they're going to go to a heavy equipment operations camp, we know that those students will be able to perform in that operations camp. So we have aviation training, we have skilled trades, law enforcement, medical careers. We have a credit recovery and a post-secondary prep session. We have boot camps that are just super in-depth in emergency trauma technician, firefighting, driver's education, and industry and jobs. We have a mini bridging future fair for our seniors only. The students come in from that and they get help with applications, scholarships. They get help for college test preparation, or even the test for the military. We have special camps in the summer that's typically 4 weeks, but we're going to try a 2-week one and have them 2 different ones, but the students can come to both. So that's 15 days for 10th through 12th graders. And then we have a capstone internship. Students actually go to the MAPS, which is the Mining and Petroleum Training Service up in Delta Junction, and they drive heavy equipment like haul trucks that carry 22 tons of material. They'll drive loaders, they'll drive telehandlers, all kinds of heavy equipment that you would find in a mine. And this gives them just an amazing amount of confidence. Not only does the MAPS program teach them to drive the heavy equipment, but they also teach them about themselves and how to get along in a camp situation. That when you're 2 weeks away from home, you're not living with your family, you're living with other people. And how does that work and how do you get along? We have an internship that's with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Students go out on a river and they're taking data that's fish and water data to see what's going on in specific rivers. We have a math science expedition for younger students doing a same longitudinal sort of study in partnership with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Our flight school, the students get in summer, get through their ground school, and then they can apply to go to the private pilot program. Currently, we have 2 students who are working on their commercial licenses. They've gotten their private pilot. They got their they did get the commercial. Now they're working on instrument. We've got a senior transition program that we help students, and we like to say that once you're in the Excel family, you're always in the Excel family. And we have students contacting us for a variety of reasons. They might need help with an application for something. They might decide that they want to go to one of the training centers and have help getting there. And we're always there for them. So up until this grant, we really had no community involvement with anything that we were doing. And we found that we really felt that it was something we needed to do, was to involve the community. So next slide. So we brought in the communities. We brought community members into Alaska, or into Anchorage, and we also went out to some of those communities to talk to them, to get their input, to meet the families of the students who were coming in, and to see if we could build a program where they were also helping us figure out what kind of curriculum is going to be the most beneficial for their students. In doing so, we wound up having community events put on by community members where they would have anything that had to do with culture, subsistence, workforce development, and college and career readiness. And those people would be able to put on events that they thought were imperative, and they did a marvelous job. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. So the grant brought support with these together, and we had sessions here in Anchorage for the students. We had teacher mentoring, where the teachers in the villages actually taught curriculum that of their choosing, that we helped support them by helping them purchase materials for that. In the classrooms, they were working on college and career readiness and workforce development. So we helped support that through purchasing as an example, one of the classrooms did blanket, and they made blankets, and then they had like a mock store, and the younger students could buy the blankets, and then the blankets that didn't sell to the younger students, they donated to the elders. But they learned how to market, they learned what a business plan was, and entrepreneurial skills. So that's the kind of things that we saw in the classroom. And then we would connect with the teachers after that and make sure that they were supported if they had any questions, if there was anything else that they needed from us. And of course, everything was followed up by a survey. So we learned a lot about how they were enjoying it, and they were all thrilled to be able to have that kind of support. The college and career summits that we had were mostly planning. We had those annually, and the teams from each one of the communities got together and they would plan out a year of activities. Next slide. So our partnership, the Cuspux School District was who the grant was written with, and then the additional was the Upiat School District. We administered the grant, meaning that we were the ones that did the work for the schools. The grant money went through the school district, but we were the ones that ran the program. And as you heard earlier, UAA was the research and evaluation. 2 school districts, 10 communities, 16 teachers, and hundreds of participants, which you'll also see later. And next slide. That's you, Dana.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. We're transitioning now to the part of the program where I was going to talk a little bit about some of our research findings from this work. And the work that I'm presenting is actually first authored by my colleague Trang Tran, who's one of our doc students in our institute. And she immigrated to the US from Vietnam, actually, for her master's degree. And when she and I were working on the program evaluation, she really got to thinking, you know, I'm seeing some parallels in the students' transition experience. It's almost like when I came to the US from another country for my learning. And then there were a lot of ways that the students' transition to college didn't look like her experience. But we thought, you know, this is a really interesting phenomenon. There's not a lot of literature about how rural students go through this process of attending a post-secondary institution. And so the study that I was going to talk about for the next couple of minutes is going to talk about our research, and it's forthcoming in the Journal of College and Student Development. It's not quite published yet, but it's been accepted. And so if anybody would like to see additional information on it, I'm happy to share in the question and answer time. So if we could please go to the next slide. The idea with the grant, if you remember from Martha's talk about all those circles, one of the places that the grant wanted to engage was post-secondary institutions that receive these students after they graduate from high school. And so the idea when the grant was written was to bring in a skilled facilitator who would go to a couple of post-secondary institutions, go onto campus, and lead a discussion between students and staff. And the idea was that students could talk about what it was like to transition to college and where they had some difficulty, and the staff would hear them. And then together, the students and staff would think about what would be a meaningful thing that they could do or change at their own institution. And that sounded good on paper, right? But when Alaska Excel and we started putting this together, the students were a little bit shy, and talking about the challenges that you experienced in front of a bunch of authority figures is a tough thing to do. To talk about challenges you've experienced personally in a large group is a tough thing to do. And when we started to get on the ground and try and plan this grant activity, we went, this has a very Western flavor. There's probably a better way to approach this that would be better for the students. So we adapted, which is common. Instead of throwing everybody into a room, Trang and I, who are trained interviewers, and we were external to the post-secondary institution, we were not authority figures in any way. We just had conversations with students ahead of time. We asked them to tell us their stories. And then what we did was a quick analysis, and we shared some talking points with the facilitator so that when everybody got together in a room, no one had to be singled out or put on the spot if they didn't want to be. And you can see here in the picture, this is one of the post-secondary institutions working on the plan to serve rural student transitions a little bit better. If we could please go to the next slide. So it all went well. We talked to all of these students, the dialogues went well, the transition planning at the post-secondary institutions went well. But after talking to 32 people, Trang and I had a lot of data. And we're evaluators on this project, but we are really researchers at heart. And so we thought, wow, these are some amazing stories. This is a treasure trove of data and information. We had so much of it. We had 25 hours of interviews, hundreds of pages of transcripts. Trang and I, as trained interviewers, had gone through the human subjects approval, so the data were suitable to be used for research purposes. And we were talking to students who we don't see represented in a lot of the academic literature, rural students, rural native students, and also staff at post-secondary institutions. If you do read about this stuff, you read a lot about faculty, maybe a little bit about academic advisors, but not some of the people who are serving really important roles for students when they go to a new institution. So Trang and I thought, there's empirical value in these data, and we want to take a deeper dive. And so we turned to the data with a research question in mind. And that was pretty simply just, how do students and the people who serve them characterize the rural transition experience? So if we could please move to the next slide. I'll say, when you get that much data, hundreds of pages of transcripts, you need some kind of a framework to analyze them. Otherwise, they're just overwhelming. And so what Trang and I did is we looked to the literature, and there's this guy, Bronfenbrenner, who said that human development is a function of people and their environments, but there's sort of different layers and ways that environments influence people and people influence one another. So starting at like the most innermost circle on this slide, it's called the macro system. Those are personal relationships, your friends, your family, your teachers, the people with whom you have personal relationships, and they certainly influence your development. But then going out, there's the mesosystem, and we call those the networks. That's when the relationships your friends have with your parents, and your parents have with your teachers, and that your teacher has with your guidance counselor. These are networks of people who all know you and support you in your growth and development. At the exosystem level, we call this the policy level or the institutional structures. These are things like church or school. They also have a huge influence on how people develop and develop a sense of identity. The macro system, we call that the cultural or the political systems within which you're living that influence your development indirectly, but they certainly shape the world you live in. And chronosystem is the time frame. And when you look at it, I mean, it kind of makes sense. It seems obvious that all of these forces are at play, but when we had a structure within which to look at these stories, it really helped us to make sense of them. So in the next slide, I have an asterisk on it, which is telling me not to spend too much time talking about methods because I tend to geek out. But anybody who wants to hear more will be here later. But just real quick to let you know how we collected the data, we said we interviewed all of these students, and we used a process called a phenomenological interview method. And the idea there is that if I were to ask you like what a big life event meant, it would be very hard to put that into words in a simple story. Like, hey, tell me what it's like to be a first-time parent, or what was it like to move to the US from Vietnam, or what's it like to get a cancer diagnosis, or what's it like to go to college as a first-generation student for the first time. I mean, these are like gigantic life experiences. They don't get answered with simple questions. So when Trang and I were talking to these students, I'm from New Jersey, that really came out when we were talking to these students, we led them through these interviews in three stages. So the first thing is we do the retrospective. Before you came to college, what did you think it was going to be like? Where did you get the idea? When did you think you wanted to come? What were your expectations? What did you think it was going to be like? And people can recall that, and we kind of guide them through that. And then we move to the procedural, kind of walk me through a typical day at college. Walk me down the hall of your dorm room. Tell me the things you see, the people you talk to, you know, where do you eat? We ask people to tell us, just walk us through the normal workaday kind of things that you experienced when you got there. And then after they've reflected on why they came and what it was actually like when they came, we are able to better understand their meaning making process when they reflect on, so what did that all mean and what did you think and how did you feel about it? So that was the type of data that we had. And for the analysis, we had all of that transcribed. And what we did is we first isolated the statements that addressed our research question, because in these stories, there's a lot of extra stuff that you hear that helps you get to know a person, but it might not be about college transitions. Then we took each piece of the story and decided what type of a relationship was it describing? Was it a personal relationship? Was it a network? Was it a structure? Were they talking about a political system or the culture? And then when we were able to divide the stories into those four categories of those concentric circles I showed you before, we were able to then see what each of those circles looked like and what the experience was for students. So in the next slide, I have a little bit more info about data analysis, and then I'll move on because I know I'm probably the only person who loves data analysis. We've got a piece of someone's story. This is actually one of the staff members here who said this in orange. And the graphic on the right shows that we went from all these interviews to transcripts. We whittled down the transcripts to the statements that addressed college transitions. We put those statements into 4 buckets. Then within each bucket, we figured out what students were saying, and we really tried to capture the fundamental essence of what the experience was like, because people tell stories in different ways, but we were looking for things that were common and germane to everybody. So reading this quote from one of the staff members, we thought that this was really addressing the culture of the place that students were going. It was a cultural experience. And the meaning unit, or what this was about, the cultural experience the student had was learning to interact with large groups of strangers. So I can move into the findings now. And if anybody wants to talk more about analysis, I'm so happy to, but we'll move into findings. So our major finding is that, you know, for everybody, going away to college or to school is a major life event. But for rural students, they experience changes at every level of this ecological framework. And so we're going to break down their experience going through each of these circles. But when we look at the different relationships and environments that give human beings structure and stability, we see that the change for rural students is different, and it's more marked than the ones that more traditional suburban students might face. And we learned from the students and the staff that if we really want to provide services for students when they come to college or to post-secondary institutions, understanding their experience is an important first step. So in the next slide, we'll look really quickly at the cultural shift. And so with transition, rural students needed to learn new cultural and social norms. So what we'll do here is we'll start at the outer systems and work in. So we've read about like the difference between the high school culture and college culture, and that was in our data too. But for rural students, what they talked more about was adjusting to urban culture. At home, what students said was that they were used to a small, close-knit community with rural values. A scholar named Matzlin has described this as a culture where everybody knows you. But when they went to college, and I'm not trying to be cliche here, but the students said they can feel like a number. And living in a large community and having to deal with strangers who don't know your name was a really big adjustment for them. And so looking at this quote here, I really thought this was a really beautiful representation of the experience. It was uncomfortable for these students to be surrounded by people they didn't know. And this isn't really a quote about the transition to college. It was about moving to an urban environment. So that was really characteristic of a cultural shift for the students we spoke to. In the next slide, we'll talk about differences at the policy level. This was pretty interesting to us because at home, students said that most of the institutions that they worked with, schools, church, tribal organizations, were focused on had a more cooperative feel to them. And being a member of their home community meant contributing and being held accountable, not just for themselves, but for the community. And when they came to the post-secondary institution, students really described structures that have more competitive in nature, not as cooperative, and that took some getting used to. They also said that there were a lot of places that were offering students help, but students had to initiate help seeking. They had to ask for the help. And that was a very different way to receive help than what they were used to at home. So for those students, it was a big shift in navigating these new institutional structures and policies. In the next slide, we'll talk about those networks. This was another big shift for students coming to urban environments. They had to curate these networks themselves. And part of that is the chrono system or the time frame change, right? You're transitioning to college, you're becoming an adult, going from, adolescence into adulthood. But at home, these networks interacted a little more organically. The teachers, parents, guidance counselors, coaches, elders in small communities, they knew one another. They interacted naturally, and they knew the students as part of that whole system. So now that students are at post-secondary, and on top of the fact that there are some policies that say they can't talk, like FERPA won't allow some networks to talk with one another directly. These networks and the people who supported the students didn't know one another. These supports didn't necessarily know students outside of the direct relationship or service that they provided for students. And that was a huge adjustment. And this is another quote from a staff member who said, this is just a different way of interacting within networks. People are using their first name, and he wanted to follow up and wasn't able to. And it was just such a great example of how it's a different way to network at the post-secondary institution than what students were used to at home. And the last one was the personal relationships. And this was a big shift for a lot of people, right? When they relocate for school, people make new friends, but rural students said this was a unique experience because they'd been going to school with the same 10 or 20 classmates for 12 years. And so to go into a classroom and not know anybody was very unusual, very uncomfortable, and something that's probably a little more familiar to an urban or a suburban students. And it wasn't just that the rural students were making new friends, but they were also maintaining relationships at home. So they were staying in touch with old family and friends using technology. The nature of their relationships with their parents, with their old friends, with their grandparents was changing. Of course, bandwidth affects that too. And these students were navigating a lot of new relationship dynamics as they were making new friends. So to think about what this all means in the next slide, and thinking about it from the perspective of Alaska Excel and the post-secondary staff who work with these students, we realized that for a lot of students who are not from rural places, some of these systems remain intact. They're familiar with an urban culture. They're familiar with curating networks. They may be used to making new friends or interacting with strangers. And the literature tells us that when, thinking of those concentric circles, when any of us experience a disruption at any level of that framework, we rely on the other levels to give us stability, to give us structure, to be familiar. So for rural students who were experiencing change at every level of the personal relationships, the networks, the policies, the culture, they need more support, but different supports than students who might be more familiar with some of those networks. And so in the next slide, just to tie this back to Excel, when we think about, it should say, yeah, there we go. When we think about what supports should be in place and where they should come from, they need to be at multiple levels too. We tend to focus a lot on the individual student, but the supports need to reinforce one another. And when we shared our findings back with students and communities in a process called member checking, we share what we share with you today, but it's actually, they helped us come to some of the conclusions, right? We checked and got their feedback. The students in the communities were the ones who said, it's not just the students who are going through a major transition here, it's the families too. And so if you're going to provide supports to students who are transitioning to college, these need to be for students and families. They need to run through that whole support network and strengthening the whole thing. And so in the last slide, before I hand it back to Martha and to Emily, I was just going to say that when we look at that framework that guided the NYCP grant, it really makes sense. The project is, serving individual students, but it's engaging some of these other networks. It's engaging K-12 schools, it's engaging post-secondary institutions, it's engaging communities, and it's fertilizing those networks that are going to support students through the whole process. And to see all of that happen harmoniously is just a pretty awesome thing. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Martha.
So the application of this was to have those 4 areas: the workforce development, college and career readiness, culture, and subsistence, introduced into the community events. So as you see in the picture, it was fishing season, it was summer, and they were canning their salmon, and it was an entire community getting together to do this. It was one of the villages upriver of Antioch in actually Tuapalak, and they did it in the school gym, obviously, had tables spread out, and they cleaned the salmon and prepared it and got it all together. Our support was giving them money for fuel for their boats, which, as you can imagine, in rural Alaska is extraordinarily expensive. And we also sent canning jars over there for them, and then they caught their salmon and processed it. They did cultural events. You saw the little girl beading earlier. They did cultural beading. They did safety. They did a lot on safety, river safety, water safety, even ice safety, how to read the markers on an ice road to make sure that you're safe on the ice road. They did some driver's education prep classes in some of the villages, resume writing. They did FAFSA preparation in some of the villages to get their students prepared for post-secondary education. And so it's bringing the entire communities together in support of not only their cultures, but in preparing their young people and for whatever it was that they were preparing to do. We've had students go to university, we've had students go into the military, we've had students go directly into the workforce, and a lot of them go to regional training centers where they actually learn how to weld, or they'll learn how to be diesel mechanics. those sorts of things where they're not actually getting a college degree, but they're getting the necessary certificates to advance in the workplace. So the Excel with the teachers, we did this brainstorming session, and we wound up doing because so many of the teachers were also community members, we wound up doing those together with the community, and they brainstormed in our summit meetings once a year, and we kept track of what they wanted to do so that when they needed supplies, we could say, well, this month is when you decided that you were going to talk about making fish traps. And so we'd get them the supplies, order them the supplies that they needed to build fish traps. Or if they were making snares, they would be getting the materials that they needed for making snares. And then we got cameras, and at the beginning they started recording elder stories in the villages, which was absolutely phenomenal. But that was kind of how we got it kicked off, and then we could collect more data for Dana.
Not for me, for the program. I work for you.
This was one of the things that we made for the to show this is the all of the districts that we partner with. The Cuspec School District and the Upiat School District are the two that we were just with this grant. So you can see that the how many students we're working with in the 1920 school year, and how much of that and how many students went through the program and learned just a phenomenal amount. Next slide. And so the communities, like I said, we all got together to plan this, and then they went out and did their own thing. We collected the data in each one of the communities. They had a sign-in sheet, so we knew how many people showed up. We had the surveys, and so they could talk about how they felt about that. And then they shared the planning of each one of their community events, and they had a team of usually about 3 or 4 that put it together. One of them would be the lead, and they would prepare all the paperwork and collect all the paperwork and make the orders, and then the other ones were helping during the event or finding someone to talk. Like if they were doing the ice road talk, they would find somebody in the community that wanted to share. It was wonderful to see the elders get involved in this, and of course a tremendous amount of this was done pre-COVID, so the elders were coming out, and having so many of the young people in the villages came to listen to the elders. It was very, very, very wonderful. Next slide. And on the lower left, or actually the left quarter of this is actually this is something that's in the files that you can access if you'd like to look at it more closely later on. It's available, but the left is, you can see that the number of classroom event participants in the school year 2019-2020 was up in the 800, and the number of community events participants was in about 500. And then the blue bars are the percent of students who wanted more events like that in their classrooms. And the second bar from the left of blue is the percent of students who believed that these events helped them prepare for their futures. The third bar is the percent of community members who believe that the events supported their community. And the last bar on farthest on the right was the percent of community members who believed that the events supported their young people. So you can see it was very, very well received and very well attended.
And if I could just jump in quickly to add how this links to the theory and the practice that we were talking about before, what was very cool is that engaging the teachers, engaging the communities, not only was this a very grassroots thing and not top down, by having teachers and community members set the tone and decide what the activities were going to be, thinking about those circles, it meant that it engaged personal relationships, it engaged networks, it was integrated into a culturally appropriate and sustainable network. It was mindful of whatever local policies and institutional structures were in place. So this approach, which was an incredible amount of work for Martha to facilitate so many events that were so different from one another. That was a lot of work, but so worth it because it was very unique and appropriate to each community. And I think Katie had a little bit of data around this too, to just pop in and chime in real quick.
Yeah, when we were talking about the teacher involvement and teacher mentoring, Excel also made sure to survey those teachers, and so we could get an idea of, is this mentoring working, and what results are we finding? And we saw a lot of growth in the teachers' knowledge, not only of just college and career readiness in general, but we saw some increase in the frequency in which they incorporated that into their classrooms. And we saw that across the board with topics like goal setting and career skills, academic strategies and preparation. And that just was really indicative of the importance of teacher mentoring, especially for these rural teachers, so that they can better serve their students. And additionally, with surveying those community members, like Martha pointed out, community members were really pleased with the events, and they really felt like they were really serving the community and supporting the youth in the community. So the data really reiterates the importance of having this holistic approach of including all members of the community, and that the work that Excel is doing is very valued.
Next slide, please. So in partnership with all of the data that was collected through the research that Dana and her team had led, through the surveys that we collected at each community event, talking with our students that we serve, we created the transition tool for our transitioning young adults, whether that is going to be into college, trade, military, or job. And as you saw and as you're learning, Alaska is very vast, and the students that we serve geographically is really spread out. Like I shared earlier, I was just in New Wixit, which is about 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and we traveled on the ice road, for me, the very first time, in very whiteout conditions yesterday. So experiencing, life in the community is extremely exciting, invigorating for an instructor like myself. Then to be able to sit shoulder to shoulder with them when they're here in Anchorage, setting up those goal settings and experiences when they're here is really beneficial. This tool supports the students no matter what step they're going to be taking after high school, and listening to the students, hearing that their challenges, trying to connect with somebody as they're transitioning to these different educational institutions across the state. Due to the limited connectivity and spotty internet at times, their preferred method happened to be making phone calls. So we collected and called, kind of breaking through the framework and working with the people in all of those different shells that Dana had presented on. And we created the transition tool to connect students to these resources across the board, from recruitment, human resources at different jobs that our students typically are stepping into regionally, and also the rural student services, for example, on campuses across the state that serve and support rural Native students on campus. And this toolkit this is what we're talking about. The toolkit is this folder that we're sending out hard copies to partners across the state. And this kit includes different pathway checklists, as we've been calling them, towards whatever step, which step that is, college, trade, military, or getting a job. And it looks like, you know, a checklist that we get to sit down and work through with them. We always say, have a plan A, but also have a plan B. That's part of making these SMART goals. Other resources included in our kit that we are serving to our students and community members and partners includes budgeting lessons for these young adults, scholarship resources that are also broken up by region, even towards like the villages, Native corporations. Some villages have upwards of 500 or smaller. And so very vast geographically, serving all of our students. This is another resource that we have tucked into our transition folder here. And this was a resource that was shared last year at the conference, as I'm told. And we incorporate this into all of our pathway checklists to be able to bring their culture and who they are and their identity into starting college or in the workforce, even through interviews and such. When we are able to be face-to-face, we sit together, we make these phone calls, we fill out applications, and we get the ball rolling. And through these times, we've been able to offer still the phone calls of three-way phone calls of connecting with the people that they're reaching out to and kind of bridging that gap for our students and sitting with them through that journey and what can feel like truly a big adventure here in Alaska on a day-to-day. And it serves our students directly to their needs and their challenges. And we've been able to set up different meetings with students. And what can look like a lot of phone numbers is a great resource tool. And again, this is going to be in our files section, but this is the connection points for the recruitment, the human resources that I was talking about, or rural services on campuses across the state. And we've shipped these hard copies to our teachers, our community partners, principals, and people that have reached out in our areas that we serve. And we would be delighted also to share kind of like our customized tools that we're using that you guys can customize for the communities that you're serving as well. Feel free to reach out through the chat or connecting through our contact information. Again, it's in the files as well. If you click through the link, you can also fill out our Google Forms that we can track as well who you're sharing the resources with, and get to have even more impact through this tool that we've created.
So back to the sessions, some of the things that you see here, the young lady on the bottom in the hard hat is going through a construction session. The young lady with the hangers in front of her, they're at a local thrift store purchasing an outfit that would be appropriate for an interview, and then we take them to their native corporation or someplace else that's one of our business partners for a mock interview. The young man who is cooking, that's at one of our post-secondary training facilities. It's the Alaska Vocational Technical Center in Seward, Alaska. He's going through the culinary program. And above that with the engine is also at AvTech, and that's the heavy diesel technology program. And to the left of that is one of the student pilots. He's getting his private pilot's license in that picture. They, when the students come in if they're coming in for the aviation program, they will be taking a discovery flight. And we've had students say, you know what, this was too scary for me. So that sort of an experience is every bit as valuable for a student to find out that it's something they don't like as it is to find out that it's something that they truly love. The students see very few jobs in their villages. They'll see someone at the post office. They'll see somebody at, they have very small stores, so they might see a clerk at the store. They see pilots. And so a lot of them decide that they want to be pilots. They fly in and out of their villages quite a lot. But then when they actually get behind the controls, they might find that they really love it or they really don't. And so our urban students have the opportunity to experience some of these jobs, having to go on field trips and stuff. But this is something that just doesn't happen in rural Alaska. So bringing them into Anchorage and letting them have these experiences, going on interactive field trips, being able to fly a plane, being able to go someplace to see if you want to be a cook, having that job interview as a skill behind you so that you'll be successful when you do apply for a job or apply for scholarships. All of it is extremely valuable and extremely rare in rural Alaska. We like to create the, whoops, can we go back? Sorry. So Dana was going to talk about the evidence of it working and the data that goes with that.
Actually, that's Katie, but what happened to Katie? Oh, it looks like she's signing back on.
There you go.
Okay. Oh, so Katie just texted and said her Zoom connection just crashed, and she's signing back on. I'll do my best to fill in, but I don't think I'll be nearly as good. Oh, there's Katie. Thank goodness, because no one wanted to hear me. Are you back?
Can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
So,
sorry about that.
You're up if you're ready. We just got to your part. If you're ready to talk about the Excel sessions and the new research we're doing.
Yes, absolutely. If we can go to the next slide. So what we decided as researchers is we really wanted to look at the Excel sessions and kind of their role in preparing students for post-secondary transitions. So Excel calls them sessions, other programs might call them camps, but we were really wanting to explore how these help students really prepare for that next step of their life, whether it be college or a career or whatever independent path they're choosing. If we could go to the next slide. So we started looking at the literature on college and career readiness, and we saw that there is a lot of information about financial aid, academic readiness, and college knowledge. But what we were seeing from the students and staff at Alaska Excel was that there's a real need for more preparation and information on life skills. So helping students with getting up on time, doing their laundry, figuring out things like time management, and making those social and emotional adjustments, learning how to make friends, and kind of figuring out what it's like to be away from home. And so in order to do this, if you can go to the next slide. So we developed this research plan where we decided to conduct more interviews with Excel students. We were following that same model of the phenomenological interview. So far we've done 6 interviews, and Excel has been extremely helpful in facilitating those interviews for us because, as we mentioned before, there's this real culture of shyness and maybe some hesitancy in dealing with strangers. And that has certainly not been easy, in addition to the fact that we have these COVID barriers, right? Of now not only are we asking these students who don't know us to speak with us about their experiences, but we're asking them to do it over Zoom, which, as we see just now, is not always a smooth process. It's not always very easy. And so that's been a bit of a barrier for us as well, is trying to get students to feel comfortable enough to talk to us about their experiences. But with the interviews that we've done so far, through our preliminary findings, we've been able to see kind of 3 common themes that we're really interested in exploring further. So the first one is, as we mentioned, this idea of, these life skills, right? Learning how to budget. That's something students talk to us a lot about. Was I have to learn about paying my rent, and then I have to learn what utilities are, and how to pay my groceries, and that job preparedness aspect of how do I write a resume, and then how do I prepare for this job interview, and then having that practice with those corporations. It's so valuable for students to be able to get that firsthand practice and to have people that are mentoring them to help them do that. We also, as Martha mentioned, that importance of having a transitionary space, right? That place to stay where they can have that environment to learn those skills, and they can have that experience of, learning how to drive and having all of these people around them, that support network that's really helpful to them. And, as Martha mentioned earlier, they're driving 4-wheelers in their communities, they're not driving cars. So I think we're seeing that these life skills that maybe are glossed over, things we're not necessarily first to think about for our independent transitions, are really, really valuable to these students. The other thing we were seeing was dealing with those feelings of homesickness. And, Excel works super hard to mitigate some of those feelings while they're at the camps or at their sessions, because they're super busy. They are learning new skills all the time. They're interacting with their communities. Here in Anchorage, they have the support of the staff, and they have the support of their fellow attendees. So like Martha mentioned, they don't really have time to be homesick, because they are heading home by the time that feeling might even sink in. So that's really, really great while they're at those sessions. But what we're finding is that the homesickness really starts to creep in after they've left Excel, after they've done those sessions, but now they're doing it on their own. And so we're really interested in finding out how we can help students tolerate homesickness in the absence of structure, and transitioning from structure in their lives, from living at home in their communities or living with Excel, to managing their own free time, and how. And finally, as we mentioned earlier, we have those feelings of overcoming shyness and that culture shock of moving from a small community to a large community. And one thing that we heard multiple times that students brought up was that they really missed the subsistence lifestyle as well. They were missing being able to go out and hunt and fish and get their meals that way, and to connect with the land. And they've mentioned that it's a lot harder to do that in Anchorage. It's a lot harder. The logistics are much different. And so we were really interested in, again, just helping with that cultural aspect, or how can these sessions really address those needs? And what role does that feeling of shyness play in making those post-secondary transitions? And so that's going forward, we really want to explore these themes a lot further, and hopefully we can get a lot more interviews done so we can get some really great data, and hopefully turn that into a paper as well.
So we're just at the end of our session, and we'd like to look ahead. So in our next slide, just to let you know where we're going to be on the research and evaluation side, I can say we are not where we thought we would be at year 3.5 of this grant. With COVID, a lot of things have changed, and we're just trying to be adaptable. We're working with Excel to collect data and do evaluation in the changing world. They're changing what they're doing, so we're changing with them, following the recommendations and restrictions that communities are setting and that our state is setting. And it's been pretty cool to see how Excel is adapted to a digital world, and the lessons learned there. But we do plan to continue our data collection and analysis. We do plan to make all of our decisions collaboratively with Alaska Excel and with the communities, and we look forward to sharing what we find broadly.
For us at Alaska Excel, if you go back one slide, please, the changes, of course, implementing changes means that we're doing a lot more online for students, which is very difficult because the cost of internet in rural Alaska, it's exorbitant. And so schools have to be in session for that to happen. We sent out hard copies of things, but in order to talk to the students, we have to call them on their phones and so on, and that doesn't necessarily work really well. We are, as Emily said, reaching out to the communities with the transitioning tool. And finally, we're mentoring students. We're having, we're calling, touching base with each and every one of the seniors to make sure that their plans are progressing and that they're not falling through the cracks. That part has been tedious. It's been extremely tedious, but the students, when they need help, they certainly are asking for it and asking questions. What do I do now? What do I do next? And it should, hopefully if this ends soon, we'll be able to be back in full swing in the fall. Last slide. So you can reach out to each of us, Dana and Katie at the university, Emily and myself here. And again, when this slide deck is available, the blue is clickable links, and on the transition tool where Emily showed you earlier, where at the top was blue and underlined, it said transition tool. You could click on that and it'll take you to the Google form to be able to get copies of that either digitally or hard copies. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, Emily, Dana, and Martha, for the very interesting and informative presentation and for sharing these wonderful resources. Be sure to download those files. We also ask that you please take our very quick 5-star rating poll in that poll tab before you leave. And I think we have about 4 minutes left, so I think we have time for at least one question. I saw in the chat box, Sandy asked, you mentioned teaching the students life skills like doing laundry and time management. How did you decide which life skills were needed, and how did you assess that they learned the skill?
We went through asking them, do you know how to do life skills? It's kind of like what we do every day, and then making sure that they knew how to do that. We have lessons planned on all of that things. The students that are here, the older students who are here for 12 days, doing laundry is a necessity. So they have to, we take them down, show them how to do their laundry and so on. They learn all kinds of things that's living out away from home where they might have other family members do that. And there's we do have all the students take surveys at the end asking them, is there anything that you wanted to learn that you were unable to learn here? That part, we typically don't have any of them say that there wasn't anything, but we take them shopping to buy groceries. They have to budget. We sit down and teach them how to budget. This is how many people you have to feed. And when they get older, we kind of turn them loose, and they're amazed that one chicken doesn't serve 20 kids. So they have to figure out what to do about that and then reassess what they did and do it over again. And all of that is part of the jobs that they have in their simulated corporations. They'll have somebody that's in charge of meals. There'll be a cook, and there'll be somebody that's the purchasing agent, and they have to go through all of that to figure it out. So whether or not they succeed is in that instance is, did you go hungry? Well, yeah. So maybe you need to reassess how much you need to purchase to feed everybody. Did that answer your question?
Think it did, and we had one other come in if we have time quickly. I love the advancements Indigenous youth are afforded to them by this program, Excel. I am, however, perturbed by training Indigenous youth to drive heavy equipment for extractive industry mining. Can the training for heavy equipment operations be divested elsewhere, for example, construction?
The reason that we have them working on the heavy equipment is because some of the companies, for example, Donlin Gold has a project going on in their region, and they have signed agreements with the native corporations that they will hire local hire, that they're not, that as absolutely as much as possible, they will provide jobs to the people in the regions where the they're economically disadvantaged because there isn't that much opportunity in their regions for jobs. So when there's a project going on, this one in particular, the surface rights and the subsurface rights are owned by the native corporations. And so they are providing jobs for the shareholders in those native corporations and people who live in those regions.
Thank you for that. And we are at time now. If you have additional questions for our speakers, you can join them in their networking session and have kind of a more informal conversation there. So thank you again all for joining. We're so glad to have you, and we'll hope to see you in the networking session. Bye, everyone.